I think of Fred as kind of the godfather of globalization.
Yeah.
FedEx planes power it. They move things around the world. It's your logistics that has made it possible for people to have globally, tightly integrated supply chains. And I don't know if all of you know this, but Fred was head of the U.S.-China Business Council at the time that China applied for accession into the World Trading Organization, and probably the most prominent advocate for that in the private sector. So he has a long history on these issues. And Fred, if I can, thank you first of all for being here, but if I can, I'd like to start by asking you, where are we? I mean, we just had this election where now President Trump attacked trade agreements, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the TPP agreement, and really attacked globalization, the sort of foundations of what's been driving the global economy for the last few decades. What do you make of that?
Well, first, Alan, I disagree with the proposition that global markets and free trade has been bad for the United States. I think quite the contrary. It's been a great thing for the country. Anybody sitting in this room that has an American passport's got to recognize that 95% of the customers that are potentially out there for businesses don't have that same passport. They're citizens of other countries. So trade is an essential part of the U.S. economic landscape. About 26.5% of our total economic activity is trade. It's not reported that way in the GDP statistics, which is one of the problems because it makes imports sort of disappear or seem to be a negative when in fact the average family in the United States, a family of four, gets about $12,000 of benefit by goods that they would have to pay much more for had we not promoted trade. And I think it's important to recognize that an anti-trade position has been tried by the United States. In 1929, Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley, both Republicans, a senator and a congressman, suggested that we wall the United States off, and actually succeeded in 1930. A lot of the scholars think that the introduction of the bill in 1929 was one of the things that triggered the Great Depression. So from 1930, over the next 2 years, trade in the United States collapsed by 60%. And one of the relatively early things that Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, did was to try to turn that around. And from that day in 1934 until just this election, opening up markets and free trade in general has been the policy of the United States. So this is quite different.
Well, Fred, there are clearly a lot of people out there. The president's message resonated with a lot of people out there. There are people out there who feel like they haven't done very well in the last couple of decades and think trade may be responsible.
Well, I think that there's no question that it resonated with a lot of people, but the facts of the matter are that manufacturing employment, including in China, has been going down everywhere. And 80 to 85% of the jobs that were lost in the manufacturing sector of the United States weren't because of China or opening markets, it was because of productivity and automation.
So this is not just happening in the U.S., obviously.
No.
Economic nationalism is on the rise all around the world. As a business person whose business depends on a globally integrated economy and who's interwoven with a globally integrated economy, how do you react to this?
Well, the most important thing is to accept invitations to get grilled by a tough guy like you and make sure that there's a contrary point of view out there. As you know, your old employer was kind enough to print an op-ed in March of last year when I saw that, and my partners at FedEx saw that this anti-trade rhetoric was really getting ahead of steam. And I gave a speech on December the 9th, which I accepted long before the election was over because Clinton had become anti-TPP and Trump had become anti-TPP. And those those positions are, by the way, you can go to policy.fedex.com. It's very simple. You can read them. I know Alan's read them because I sent them to him. But as you know, I mean, it puts the other side of the case out there that trade is a very good thing for the United States and something we should embrace. Now, there are issues, particularly with China, but in general, the U.S. policy from 1934 forward, in my opinion, has been the correct policy.
I'll go to China in a minute, but is there any, there was, for instance, General Electric, in their annual report, Jeff Immelt talked about how he was changing the way he runs the company in order to nod to this growing economic nationalism, doing more local production. Do you find trade patterns are changing because of rising economic nationalism, and is it changing the way you run the business?
Well, I think sometimes people lean into political slogans when the economics are driving them there anyway. If you look at the automotive industry, for instance, in the 1970s and 1980s, the Japanese automotive industry revolutionized the world with high-quality, low-cost vehicles using American methodology that Dr. Deming and Dr. Duran developed during World War II to make a fantastic industry. That led to a huge trade dust-up because the Japanese wanted to sell to us, but they wanted to keep many of their markets closed, which unfortunately, much of which was corrected in the TPP that's now been thrown aside. So I think that the increase in the Japanese currency relative to the dollar, plus the negotiations during the Reagan administration, led the Japanese to make enormous investments in the United States to build automobiles here. So most of the Japanese automobiles today are actually produced in the United States, many of which are in Tennessee, because our then governor, Lamar Alexander, now our senior senator, recruited those industries into Tennessee. So as the value of currencies go up, the heavier the item, generally the logistics prevail and you want to make them locally. The lighter the item, the more that they are easily tradable and moved. So some of that is just a natural function of the currency trends and the logistics underlying the trade that's involved.
So let's talk about China for a minute. I was there in Davos when President Xi Jinping came and said, in effect, I'm paraphrasing now, but in effect he said, okay, if President Trump doesn't want to embrace globalization, I will be the champion of globalization. I think globalization is important to the economy, and China is prepared to take the lead.
Well, I think that President Xi is a very smart man, because when you see a market opportunity in a vacuum, you want to come in with a differentiated product. Having said that, I actually think that one of the reasons President Trump got elected and the people were disaffected in the election cohorts that you just mentioned was the mercantilism and protectionism, first by the Japanese, which was an enormous part of the Reagan administration. In fact, Robert Lighthizer, who is on deck to be the USTR, now a Skadden Arps lawyer, very proficient in the WTO and anti-dumping tariffs, is going to be the United States U.S. trade representative. He cut his teeth on putting anti-dumping duties in place and so forth.
Against the Japanese? Against
the Japanese in the 1980s. Now, listen, I am a huge friend of China, as you mentioned. I'm going to show you a couple of slides here in a minute that some of the Chinese participants here, I think you'll be surprised at the first picture I'm going to put up. But the reality is that China, over the last 10 or 15 years, has been very mercantilist, very protectionist, has engaged in forced technology transfer, and has at least acquiesced, if not actively promoted, cyber espionage. Those things need to change, and I think that
Could this be the moment?
I think that it is, that it is, Alan, because you know, when President Trump took the phone call from the president of Taiwan and then made his statement about perhaps we needed to rethink about the one China policy, there were a lot of people that are knowledgeable about the situation, including myself, that made sure the administration understood that this was an issue that China simply would not negotiate on. There's probably one or two more, but that one and the primacy of the Communist Party, the two most important that I know of. Now, China's got to understand that there are certain things that the United States holds in the same level of importance. And I would submit right at the top of the list is, number one, the freedom of the seas. The United States has spent a lot of blood and treasure keeping freedom of the seas, and the new China policy is somewhat akin to saying we control all the waters between here and Bermuda and Venezuela. Now, maybe the Monroe Doctrine 100 and some odd years ago is a loose parallel, but World War II has taken place. There needs to be freedom of navigation. That's an issue that the United States would consider inviolable and has stated so. And I think in the same vein, because of the election results, that China will now find that many of these practices that the United States acquiesced in have reached a point where there needs to be a mutual cooperation. The good news is that President Xi and the Prime Minister Li of China have stated publicly that making China a more liberal economy is in the very best interest of them moving to a consumer-driven economy rather than totally dependent on exports, investments, particularly public works and real estate. So there's the making of a deal here, and I was delighted here today to hear that, and I don't know whether this is correct, that President Xi is going to come over and there's going to be
Mar-a-Lago.
a meeting. Well, even better. So
Mar-a-Lago. And we'll go to your slides in just a minute, but before we do, what does that deal look like? I mean, you've actually, you started out kind of pessimistic about U.S. policies and China policies, but you had an optimistic outcome that you think they're the grounds for a deal. What do you want to see in that deal? What should the...
Well, I think the first thing, as I mentioned to you, was the recognition on the part of the administration that the art of the deal statement about let's re-examine the two China policy or whatever you want to call it was pulled back based on the input of a lot of people that told the administration how important this was to China. But China has to understand that President Trump was elected at least under the rhetorical umbrella of we're involved in an unfair trade situation. But let me give you one statistic that shows how these two things come together. In the op-ed that I wrote for the Wall Street Journal that I mentioned, I talk in there about the deregulation that took place in this country from 1970 to 1990. What that did was to take our logistics cost in this country from 16 cents out of every dollar. Every time you buy a steak, every time you buy an egg, every time you buy an iPad, or well, they didn't have iPads in those days, whatever we were buying, 8 tracks, it was 16 cents out of the dollar. It's 9 cents on every dollar today. All of that improved productivity has gone into improved social benefits, standard of living, and so forth. In China today, logistics costs are 18% of GDP. And it's because of too much regulation at the local level, the provincial level, the national level, and it needs to be liberalized, and world-class competitors should compete in the logistics sector to the productivity.
They're not allowing you to do your thing.
Well, we were, despite all of our efforts to help China and be involved in China, we were one of the targets of China's mercantilism and had to fight like hell when they changed the law and took us out from under the MOFCOM regime and passed a new postal law. They refused to give us our licenses. We eventually got them. It was a long process and we appreciate it, but it was an overt attempt to retard us to promote local champions. And that is the policy of China. It's called indigenous innovation. They want Chinese companies to be their number ones in their various segment. Manufacturing 2025 is another. So I think that those types of policies, which may make sense, I don't really believe this, just look at Brazil and Argentina, but let's assume that you could make a case for them. You can do that for a much smaller economy. China's the second largest economy in the world today. So many of these things that President Xi and Premier Li say about opening up the market are the same things we want. And that's the nature, that's the basis of the deal.
Let's take a look at your slides here.
Well, these slides will be but they tell a little story. Just put up the slides there. First of all, for those of you who don't know about it, FedEx has 4 operating divisions.
Oh, wait, this is the advertisement?
That's it. It's over. Go ahead. Now the next, but a lot of people don't know the way FedEx is organized. This is a photograph that some of the people from China would surely recognize of the FedEx Board of Directors being hosted by the legendary president of China, Jiang Zemin, who was a great friend. He had a beautiful voice, by the way, and was a great fan of Elvis and sang all of his songs perfectly. But the point is, FedEx was an integral part of opening up China to the world, and he hosted us in his office, the FedEx Board of Directors. He asked us to put a hub in China, and in actual fact, in response to that, we did. We moved our major hub into China. I was glad to meet the Vice Mayor Chai over here. The first thing I asked him, do we owe you any landing fees or any money? He said no. But
that's good.
Go through a couple of the other slides. Just scroll through that's just a drawing of our hub in Guangzhou. Here's a picture of the Guangzhou hub in operation at night. You can see that's our Asia One system. It connects the entire Asian theater over Guangzhou. It's a big deal for the airport and for
Guangzhou is kind of the Memphis of that part of the world.
It is absolutely, and there are thousands of companies that locate there for access to our system.
Yeah.
Pull the next one up. And of course, we fly all over the world, including between Guangzhou and Europe on the backside of the world, from our point of view. That's a picture of our new operation in Shanghai that opens in a couple of months in our northern China hub. That's a local domestic hub in Hangzhou, the beautiful city down south of Shanghai. Keep going. That's our network in China. Now, we're not heavily involved in the retail e-commerce business in China, the Alibaba and the JD.com and the YTO and Shengfeng, because it was essentially held for the Chinese interests, which is what's important. But our spot in China is really business to business, very high, critically important items, defibrillators, aircraft parts. It ties into our intercontinental system. Go on the next one. That's just a local station in Chengdu. So FedEx is doing well in China and an important part of the Chinese economy. So I just put these photographs up so the people here could get a feel that I'm not just talking from an academic standpoint. We're heavily involved inside the economy. Oh, this is one. That's Bao Bao. We flew Bao Bao last week or the week before. When was it, Sam? I should have introduced my daughter Sam and Patrick Fitzgerald of our organization over there, by the way. That's Bao Bao. And the next shot is a FedEx 777, which took off from FedEx Dulles Dulles Airport outside of Washington and flew Bao Bao nonstop 16 hours to Chengdu, which is why I showed you the station there.
I want to take a couple of questions from the audience, but before I do that, that was good. I like that, especially Bao Bao. Where did Bao Bao fly to? It was like
Chengdu. He flew from Dulles. We've flown all of them. We brought Bao Bao's parents in 2020, in 2000 to to the Washington Zoo. We've flown them to Scotland, to Paris, to Memphis.
You have frequent flyer cards for?
Well, pretty much so. They've got, well, he's got his own pen, as you saw. So,
anyone have a question or a comment? Got a couple of mics out there if you do. Yes, right here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Poppy Harlow with CNN. Nice to see you again. I haven't seen you in years, and nice to meet your daughter as well. I'm really interested in just building on Alan's first question about trade. I mean, I've seen it being, I'm from Minnesota, reporting across the Rust Belt during the campaign. I go out a lot for my show now. I just spent a lot of time in Beattyville, Kentucky, the poorest white town in America. And they really welcomed us with open arms, and it's the heart of Trump country. And for so many of them, they feel hope for the first time in, more than half a century. I mean, it's very close to where President Johnson, declared the war on poverty. So my question to you is, from your 30,000-foot view, what is the one thing that you think that Congress and this administration could do together to lift the most people up, to help close that opportunity gap a little bit more? Because you're right, those numbers show that 87% of the manufacturing jobs lost since 2000 are because of automation, not because of trade.
well, what's happened to the United States over the last 25 years, in my opinion, is we've had the twin effects of the failure of an educational system that's not producing the types of blue-collar workers that we need for the 21st century jobs that we have today. There are millions of unfilled high-wage jobs today in the United States. There's just a gap of skills and people to fill them. So I think you're seeing a tremendous effort throughout the country. In Tennessee, we are now offering community college for free. In other words, it's no longer K through 12 public education, it's K through 2 years of community college. We're putting community college students through an institution next to Memphis, they're not aircraft mechanics, which connotes, greasy-fingered people with wrenches. These are digital technicians that take care of those 777s like the Panda Express you saw there. And after they do their internship, those are, with benefits and everything, $150,000 a year jobs. So the first problem is the mismatch of the educational. The second problem is our tax code. Our tax code penalizes investment, and Wall Street penalizes investment. So our capital equipment investment in the United States, it hasn't even gotten back to 2007 levels. Our public infrastructure investment, roads, highways, and so forth, is at 1947 levels. I testified in Congress a couple of weeks ago, and let me give you a statistic here that you will just say, wow. We get half as much mileage on our trucks, and we drive almost 3 billion miles a year than we did 20 years ago because of the state of the interstate highway. Just that one statistic tells you everything you need to know.
Are you optimistic that this administration is going to make some progress on those last two, taxes and infrastructure?
I think that we've advocated, Alan, over and over again to raise the gasoline and diesel tax back to the levels that inflation would have taken it had it not been capped in 1994. If you do that over a 5 or 7 year period of time, you've got plenty of money at the federal level to invest in interstate highways, repair, maintenance, and additions. There are 20 segments. I won't say they're shovel ready, but they're a hell of a lot closer to shovel ready than some of the things that have been talked about in the past. So we've got to pay for them. And in my opinion, this idea of the infrastructure bank and so forth, that's a wonderful idea, but you can do what I just said with a 1-paragraph bill tomorrow.
Raise the gas tax.
Just raise the gasoline and the diesel tax.
Fred, you were talking, on the first one, you were talking about education. We have an interesting story in the new issue of Fortune magazine about what AT&T has done, which is pretty amazing. It's, 100,000 people who were, trained in switching technology. They're going to give them advanced degrees in digital computer technology if they want to do it. How much is it the responsibility of business to deal with the education problem?
Well, I think it's absolutely what's going to happen. I mean, business has to have the talent, as I gave you with the example of the FedEx AMTs that maintain the 777. So public policy, Tennessee's raising the free threshold so you can go to community college, and we will interface with our local community colleges to produce these AMTs. I think that revolution is taking place in front of everybody, not to mention the astronomical increase in prices of a lot of the prestigious colleges. I mean, people are smart. They're going to figure out if I can get a $150,000 a year job being a FedEx digital technician on a 777, that degree in anthropology or whatever the case I was thinking about maybe needs to, practicality considerations need to. So I think it's already happening. I think the real tragedy is in the inner cities where the fundamental education is failing so many kids, and y'all have written a lot of things about that.
Yes, right here.
Thank you, Dan Rosen with the Rhodium Group. In 2000, I was with the PNTR War Room at the White House when you were chairing the Business Council. We got HR 4444 passed, and China joined the World Trade Organization. It's a long time since that happened. We're talking about your opportunity to compete inside China. Are Chinese companies coming out and investing in your backyard in the States and around the world in a way that has you ready to ask for reciprocity in terms of how we treat Chinese outbound direct investment, or is that premature?
Well, first of all, we would have no objections to that whatsoever, assuming there were a level playing field. And secondarily, Chinese firms, particularly Alibaba, JD.com, and others, are selling a tremendous amount of stuff to the United States through e-commerce channels, and we are selling a surprising amount back to China. So it hasn't come full-blown where there's a Chinese global competitor like we have in Germany and DHL, but I don't think there's any question that that will happen.
As part of this Mar-a-Lago conversation, do you think it would make sense for President Xi to come with promises of investment, job-creating investment in the U.S.?
You know, Alan, I think most of the comments about I'm going to create jobs here, there, and the other places I gave you on that little comment about General Electric, they're mostly being created because the businesses need to create the jobs anyway. So,
you don't think policy makes a big difference?
Sure, on the margin, of course it makes a difference. But in the scheme of things, if you ask me, do I think the vast majority of jobs in the United States will be created because the president and his cabinet wants them to be put in the United States? The answer is no. You have to have a tax and regulatory regime that makes it a good thing to invest in the United States. And the investment will come if you do that.